The cowboy thought he was giving a starving child nothing more than bread and kindness. But when dawn broke, the earth trembled beneath the hooves of 200 warriors. They weren't there for war, at least not yet. They stood in silence outside his barn, faces painted, eyes unblinking, waiting for him. What began as an act of mercy had become a moment that could tip the frontier toward bloodshed, or an unexpected alliance. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The cowboy's boots pressed into the cold earth as he stepped beyond the wooden threshold of the barn, every nerve screaming at him to retreat, yet some unseen force pulling him forward into the presence of the gathered warriors whose very silence carried more weight than 1,000 shouted threats, their painted faces like masks carved from stone, unreadable and sharp, their eyes glinting with something ancient and immovable. Behind him, the small child he had pulled from hunger and despair clutched at the worn leather of his duster, trembling so violently that the cowboy could feel it through the fabric, yet no cry escaped the boy's lips, as though he too understood the enormity of the moment. The fragile thread between mercy and doom stretched so thin that a single word might snap it. The horses pawed at the ground, their snorts sending puffs of steam into the morning chill, tails lashing, ears flicking at ghosts in the silence, the rising sun casting long shadows across the prairie, painting the warriors in hues of fire and blood, making them seem like spirits risen from the earth itself, summoned to test the heart of one solitary man who stood between their judgment and their wrath. The cowboy's hand twitched near the butt of his revolver, not out of eagerness to draw, but from the raw instinct of survival clawing at the edges of his mind. Yet he knew that steel and powder would not save him here. Not against 200 riders whose bows and lances gleamed like the teeth of the desert, not against men who had crossed generations of struggle and memory, and who now waited with the patience of predators for him to make the first mistake. He swallowed, the dryness of his throat turning the act into a rasp, and though his pulse hammered in his temples, he forced himself to meet the eyes of the man at the center of the host, a figure taller than the rest, draped in a robe of wolf pelts, his face painted in streaks of black that cut across his cheekbones and brow, his stare unwavering and cold as if he were not looking at a man, but at a story unfolding, weighing whether this tale would end in fire or peace. For a long burning moment nothing happened, until the child at his side let out a small, broken sound, a whimper. A fragment of fear or hunger or memory, and in that fragile sound the warriors stirred, not with weapons raised, but with glances exchanged, a ripple of human recognition threading through their ranks, as if reminded that beneath paint and pride and fury, they too had children who cried in the night, children who reached for fathers and mothers in hunger and fear. The cowboy sensed the change but dared not speak, for he knew his voice could shatter what was forming. So instead he bent one knee, lowering himself to the child's level, pressing a steadying hand to the boy's shoulder, not to comfort him but to show the watching warriors that he would stand as shield, that mercy had not been an accident of circumstance but a choice carved into his bones. The leader's eyes narrowed, his hand lifting not to signal attack but to still his men, palm flat against the morning light, and then in a voice as deep as stone grinding against stone he spoke the first word since dawn had broken. A single syllable in a tongue the cowboy did not know but felt in his chest more than his ears, a word that carried neither threat nor welcome, but something in between, a test, a question unspoken. Who are you, man of the frontier, to take in what we have left behind, and what will you do now that we stand at your door? The cowboy stood as though nailed to the earth, his breath shallow and ragged in his chest, the child's small fingers still clutching at his duster like a lifeline. And in the cavernous silence he could not escape the gnawing thought that what he had done out of mercy might have been twisted in the eyes of these warriors into something shameful, something that cut against their code. For what if in saving the boy he had stolen him from a ritual, from a trial, from a fate that belonged not to him but to the people whose eyes now burned into his flesh like brands? Each painted face was a mirror he could not read, streaked with colors that spoke of battles fought before he was born, of ancestors who had walked the plains when the land was still wild and unclaimed, and he felt suddenly so small, so foolish, standing there with dust on his boots and fear in his gut, as if he were no more than a trespasser at the edge of a sacred fire, waiting for judgment that might fall like lightning. His mind raced back to the boy's hollow cheeks, the hunger carved into his ribs, the way he had fallen against him when bread touched his lips, and the cowboy had thought it nothing but simple kindness, the kind any man ought to offer to another. But now, under the unblinking stare of 200 riders, it felt less like charity and more like theft, as though he had taken something precious without knowing, and the weight of it pressed harder with every heartbeat, every flick of restless horse hooves. He wondered if they saw him as arrogant, a settler daring to meddle in affairs too old and sacred for his touch, or if they saw him as ignorant, a fool too blind to know he had crossed a boundary sharper than any blade. And yet no voice came to tell him his crime, only the thunder of silence, each man's gaze a question without words, a demand that he answer not with speech but with the marrow of who he was. Sweat trickled beneath his hatband, down his temple, though the morning air still held the bite of night, and he swallowed hard against the stone in his throat, feeling how utterly alone he was, a single figure measured against the might of a nation, a trespasser standing trial before a people who spoke with their stillness. And in that heavy pause, when the earth itself seemed to listen, he understood that mercy was not enough, that a crust of bread and a soft word did not make him righteous in their eyes, for they were weighing more than his deed, they were weighing his intent, his heart, the truth of him laid bare in the way he stood or faltered. The child whimpered again, softer this time, and the cowboy felt it cut through him, for the sound carried not only fear but a plea, a reminder that though he doubted himself, he had given this boy life when death had been closer, and no painted face could take that from him. So he straightened his shoulders, refusing to shrink though the weight of their judgment bore down, and he let his eyes travel across the wall of warriors, one by one, meeting their stares as if to say, "If I have trespassed, it was in the name of compassion, and if that be an insult, then let me carry it upon my back. But I will not repent for saving a child from hunger." The leader's gaze lingered on him, unreadable still, yet something flickered at the edges of it, not approval, not forgiveness, but a recognition that this man would not bend in shame, and in that recognition the silence grew heavier still, as though the decision of an entire people hovered just beyond the reach of words. Unseen eyes and unspoken questions pressing closer, waiting to see if this lone cowboy could stand beneath the weight without breaking. The cowboy's heart lurched when the silence broke, not with war cries or the glint of drawn steel, but with the sound of leather creaking as one of the oldest among them, a man whose hair fell like silver rain against the lines of his weathered face, slid from his horse with the dignity of a mountain bowing to time, his moccasins pressing into the dirt with the same weight as history itself, and in his arms he carried a bundle wrapped in rawhide, held as carefully as one might bear a child, until he stepped through the sea of painted warriors and stopped before the lone cowboy, the boy at his side shrinking against his leg. The elder lowered the bundle with deliberate care, setting it on the earth between them, and when the leather folds opened, the cowboy's eyes widened at what was revealed: strips of fresh venison, still rich with the scent of the hunt, bundles of herbs bound with sinew, their fragrance sharp and grounding, and carved tokens of bone and wood, each etched with symbols the cowboy could not read but which vibrated with meaning nonetheless, as if they carried the weight of prayers, of promises, of memory itself. For a long moment he did not breathe, his throat tightening as he realized this was no warning, no curse, but an offering, a gesture not of vengeance but of acknowledgement, and the shock of it hit him harder than any threat could have. For he understood then that the people arrayed before him had come not to demand blood, but to give recognition, to meet his act of mercy with a response deeper than gratitude, one that bound him to them in ways he had not asked for and could not refuse. He looked up into the elder's eyes, searching, but there was no malice there, only the calm fire of a man who had seen too many winters to waste words, and in that gaze the cowboy read a truth that unsettled him more than any weapon. The boy had not been abandoned. He had been watched, his suffering known, and the choice the cowboy had made had been seen by eyes he had not realized were upon him. And now he stood accountable not for trespass but for compassion, judged worthy enough to be answered with gifts that carried the weight of ceremony. The warriors shifted, their horses restless, yet none moved against him, and he realized with a shiver that their silence had not been one of judgment alone, but of waiting to see if he understood the magnitude of what had been set before him, if he would accept, not just meat and herbs but the bond they implied, a tether between him and a people whose lives flowed like rivers through this land, long before his boots ever touched it. He bent slowly, his hand hovering over the bundle, hesitant, for to take it was to step into a story larger than his own, a story that could draw him into loyalty, into expectation, into peril, and yet he could not deny the honor of it, the raw humanity shining through the gesture. And so with deliberate care he lifted one of the carved tokens, tracing the grooves cut by hands more skilled than his own, and as the weight of it settled in his palm, he felt the tension in the air shift. The warriors no longer stared as if at an intruder, but as if at a man who had been tested and had chosen rightly. The boy pressed closer to him, small and trembling, and the cowboy placed the token in the child's hand, a silent promise that the gift had not been given to him alone, but to the life he had saved. And the elder's eyes softened, the faintest nod breaking the mask of solemnity, a nod that said, "You have done what few would, and for that, we see you." The cowboy's fingers trembled against the carved token, as though it weighed more than bone and wood, as though the grooves pressed into his palm were pressing into his very soul. And in that fragile moment, staring at the bundle of venison and herbs laid at his boots, the silence of the warriors around him gave way to the louder silence inside his own heart, the silence of memory, of failure, of the things he could not change. He saw again the fever that had swept through his home like a ghost in the night, stealing the breath from his wife while he sat powerless at her bedside, clutching her hand as though his grip could tether her to the earth. And when the dawn came, she was gone, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who could not protect the one he had sworn his life to. He remembered the ranch, too, the acres of stubborn land that he had worked with bleeding hands, only to watch the soil grow stingy and the cattle thin, the storm stripping away what little he had managed to build, leaving him with half-dead fields and half-formed hopes. And in the long nights he had often cursed himself for believing he could wrestle a living out of earth that did not want him. Now, here before the eyes of 200 warriors, he wondered how a man so marked by loss, so twisted by guilt and futility, could stand as the subject of honor, as the recipient of gratitude from a people who owed him nothing. His breath came ragged, disbelief cracking through him like a whip, and he thought perhaps they had mistaken him for someone else, some better man, someone who had not knelt helpless at his wife's grave, someone whose fields had not turned to dust beneath his boots, someone who had not stood by watching too much slip through his fingers. He wanted to tell them that he was no hero, that his bread had been nothing but a crust salvaged from his own dwindling larder, that he had given it out of instinct more than grace, that he was not the man they thought him to be. But the words turned to ash in his throat as he glanced at the boy pressed against his side, the child's wide eyes reflecting not judgment but a desperate trust, as though the cowboy's strength was the only thing anchoring him to life. And in that gaze he felt the cruel truth: small acts mattered, because sometimes they were all that stood between death and survival, between despair and one more day of breath. And even if he doubted himself, even if he hated the reflection of his own failures, the child did not. Yet still the guilt gnawed at him, whispering that this recognition was a mistake, that it would unravel the moment they saw him for what he truly was. And his hand hovered uncertainly above the gift as if afraid to accept it, afraid to claim a worthiness he did not believe he possessed. The elder who had laid it down did not move, did not speak, only watched him with the steady eyes of a man who had seen others break beneath the weight of their own regrets. And in that stare the cowboy felt both judged and forgiven, both unworthy and somehow chosen. And though his chest ached with the fracture of guilt and disbelief, though his memories of fevered nights and barren fields clawed at him like old wounds reopened, he could not deny the warmth rising in him at the thought that maybe, just maybe, even a man broken by loss could leave behind something more than failure, that perhaps mercy, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways he would never fully understand. The cowboy stiffened when the child at his side, who had been silent save for broken whimpers since the dawn, suddenly lifted his face from the shadow of his coat and whispered into the heavy stillness, his voice thin and trembling, yet steady enough to cut through the silence that weighed upon the gathering like a mountain. And though the words tumbled out in a tongue the cowboy could not begin to grasp, the cadence carried more power than any translation could, a tone threaded with raw need, with a plea that was not for food or water but for acknowledgement, for belonging, for life itself. The sound seemed to ripple outward, striking chords within the assembled warriors, who straightened in their saddles, whose painted faces flickered with emotions too swift to pin down, as though the child's voice had stirred something dormant, a memory of sons and daughters, of kin carried off by hunger or disease, of small hands that had once clutched theirs in the night. The cowboy, bewildered, could only stand rooted, his heart thrumming as if the boy's words had reached through the cage of his ribs and pressed upon the sore places there, places still marked by fever and barren soil. Yet he knew from the quiver in the child's voice that this was no casual utterance, it was supplication, a prayer in miniature, spoken not to the cowboy but to the gathering of his people who loomed before him, and he felt the weight of being only the vessel, the keeper of a mercy that had allowed this voice to rise again. And then, as if sealing the air with significance, the elder who had placed the bundle at his feet nodded once, a movement small in measure but vast in meaning. And in that gesture the cowboy understood what his ears could not, that something sacred had been answered here, that the boy's plea had not fallen into silence but had struck the heart of his people, and the elder's nod was acknowledgment that the act of saving him had fulfilled a thread of destiny too fragile for steel or law to touch. The cowboy's throat tightened, his disbelief clashing with awe, for it seemed impossible that his ragged crust of bread, given in a moment of pity, could now stand as the hinge upon which such solemnity turned. Yet as the boy leaned against him, whispering the last of his words like the dying echo of a hymn, the cowboy saw in the elder's eyes a confirmation that this had been no accident, that mercy itself was a bridge between worlds, and whether he wished it or not, he had become the keeper of that bridge, bound now by more than hunger or chance, bound by a people's recognition and by the soft, undeniable voice of a child whose survival had awakened the sacred. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment pressing heavier than iron, heavier even than the graves he carried in his heart, and though every bone in him screamed to turn back, to retreat into the barn's shadow, to bar the doors and vanish into the anonymity of dust and hard labor, he could not move, for the warriors still waited, a wall of silence and expectation that chained him to the earth. His pulse pounded with the knowledge that their trust, laid before him in venison, herbs, and carved tokens, was no casual gift but a burden, an inheritance he had not sought and did not want, and to accept it meant stepping into a role he feared would devour him, a role too large for a man who had failed his own wife, his own land, himself. His eyes darted to the child at his side, the boy's small shoulders trembling, yet his gaze fixed on him with a trust that was almost unbearable. And in that gaze the cowboy saw what the warriors must see, a protector, a man who had chosen mercy where others might have chosen indifference, a man whose act had carried weight even if he himself could not believe it, and the thought tore at him, for he knew the truth. He was no savior, no leader, just a tired rancher clinging to the scraps of his own ruined life, and yet if he turned away now, if he denied their offering, he feared he would not only shame himself but also condemn the child to a second abandonment, one far crueler than the first. Still, the part of him that had known failure's lash whispered that to accept meant danger, meant entanglement in a people's struggle, meant enemies he had not yet seen rising against him like storms over the plains, and he did not know if he had the strength to bear it. His breath came harsh, shallow, and he longed to speak, to tell them he was unworthy, to plead that they look elsewhere, to insist he was only a man who had given bread because he could not stand to watch a child starve. But when his lips parted, no words came, for their eyes, the eyes of 200 warriors, burned into him with the weight of expectation too deep for speech, and he knew then that this was no choice between retreat and acceptance, but between dishonor and responsibility, between fleeing into the shell of his failures or daring to carry a trust he did not understand. His heart beat a frantic drum, and for one aching moment he imagined what it would be like to turn, to close the barn behind him, to let the silence of solitude swallow him whole. But the image shattered when the child's small hand found his again, fingers curling with a silent plea that tethered him tighter than chains, and the cowboy realized with a hollow ache that trust was not something a man chose. Sometimes it was laid upon him like a mantle, whether he wanted it or not. And though he stood trembling at the edge of it, staring at the expectant wall of warriors, he understood that by saving one starving child he had already stepped across the line, and there was no retreat left to him. The prairie night fell heavy with a velvet darkness pierced only by the crackling glow of firelight, its warmth stretching long fingers across the open earth. And though the cowboy had told himself he would remain in the safety of his barn, away from the gathering of painted faces and restless horses, the child's small tug on his sleeve had drawn him out beneath the stars, his reluctant steps carrying him to the circle, where the warriors had kindled flame and shadow into something older than the land itself. He felt their eyes follow him as he approached, not hostile but measuring, as if they weighed each movement, each breath, against the fire's glow. And when he sat at the edge of the circle, the boy pressed tight against his side. A space opened wordlessly for him, an acknowledgement he could not deny. Platters of roasted venison passed hand to hand, smoke curling with the rich tang of herbs, and though his stomach twisted with unease, he accepted a portion, the taste sharp and earthy, grounding him in the reality that he was now partaking of their sustenance, their ritual, a gesture of inclusion as binding as any oath. The boy ate beside him, hunger gnawing away fear, and the cowboy, watching him, felt both pride and dread. Pride that the child lived to see another night, dread that his act had tied them both to this circle in ways neither could yet understand. Around them, voices rose in fragments, words exchanged slowly, haltingly, as the warriors tried their English and he stumbled awkwardly over sounds in their tongue, laughter occasionally breaking the solemnity when meanings tangled. And though the words were broken, the intent behind them was clear. A bridge was being built, fragile yet real, across the vast gulf of culture and mistrust, and each syllable carried the risk of misunderstanding but also the spark of recognition. Drums began, low at first, a heartbeat pressed into hide, then rising and falling like wind over the plains, their rhythm pulling at something deep in the cowboy's chest, reminding him of nights long past when he had listened to his wife's breathing beside him, steady as a song, and though the memory stung, the drums softened its edges, as if to say loss was part of the rhythm too. The fire popped, embers scattering into the night like fleeting stars, and the silence between the beats grew as significant as the sound itself. A silence heavy with things unspoken, alliances unformed, dangers lurking beyond the circle's glow, the knowledge that this fragile unity could collapse with a single spark of mistrust. Yet as he sat there, the boy's head nodding heavy with sleep against his arm, the cowboy felt the firelight seep into his bones, felt the circle's warmth pull him out of his solitude. And though peril loomed like a storm beyond the horizon, for that moment he was not merely a man alone with his grief and failures, but a part of something larger, something that pulsed with both promise and danger. And in the space between drumbeat and silence, he dared to wonder if unity could be born from such a fragile fire. The fire burned low, its glow painting the warriors in shades of amber and shadow, when the elder rose from his seat with the slow gravity of a man whose every movement carried the weight of decades, his eyes glinting like coals as he turned to the cowboy, and though his words came broken and halting in the settler's tongue, their meaning was sharpened by the urgency in his gestures, the sweep of his hand toward the horizon, the tightening of his jaw as he spoke of another band rival warriors, restless with hunger and anger, already sharpening their blades for blood, their hatred aimed not only at the pale settlers who had pressed too far into the plains but also at their own kin who dared treat with them. The cowboy leaned forward, heart quickening as the fragments of speech knitted together in his mind. Danger. Coming soon. Fire and death spilling across both their worlds unless some hand held back the tide. And the elder's hand pressed firmly against the cowboy's chest, just above his heart, as if to brand him with a truth he could not escape, that by saving the starving child, he had stepped into a place between enemies, chosen not by himself but by fate, or by the eyes of a people who had seen his mercy and marked him for it. Disbelief battled with fear inside him. For what did he know of being a bridge between warring nations, when he could scarcely mend the fractures of his own life? Yet the elder's gaze did not waver, and the circle of warriors watched in silence, as though they too awaited his acceptance of a burden no sane man would welcome. His throat felt raw, his hands restless, and he wanted to cry out that they were wrong, that he was nothing but a failed rancher with empty fields and too many ghosts, that he had no wisdom, no strength to turn aside the storm that was gathering. But the child stirred at his side, eyes heavy with sleep, yet watching him still. and in that fragile gaze the cowboy felt the truth of the elder's warning settle like stone upon his shoulders. He could walk away, hide in his barn, pretend none of this touched him, but the storm would find him all the same, and when it did, the boy, the warriors, and his own land would burn. The drums had fallen silent now, the only sound the crackle of dying fire, and in that hush the cowboy felt the vastness of the choice before him: step into peril not of his making, or stand aside and let the frontier drown in blood. And though every scar in him recoiled, though the voice of his failures whispered that he was unfit, the elder's steady hand on his chest seemed to ignite something faint and stubborn within him, a spark that told him mercy once given could not be denied its consequence. And he understood, with a shudder that ran bone deep, that his act of kindness had not merely saved a child, it had bound him to a role he could neither refuse nor escape, the bridge no one wanted but the only one left standing. The night pressed down on him like a living weight, heavy with the smell of hay and the creak of old timber as he paced the length of his barn, boots grinding against the dirt-packed floor with each restless turn, his mind clawing at itself in circles as relentless as the wind outside. Sleep would not come, not with the elder's words burning through him, not with the memory of painted faces and firelit eyes, watching him as though he were something more than the broken man he knew himself to be. And each step only deepened the chasm of his dilemma. On one side lay the settlers, his own kind, though they regarded him with narrowed eyes and whispered doubts, men who had always seen him as an outsider even before his ranch had begun to fail, men who would call him traitor if they knew he had sat among the warriors and broken bread, who might turn on him as quickly as they would turn on those gathered at his doorstep. On the other side lay the child, sleeping now in the loft, his small breath steady as if he had never known hunger, his fragile trust wrapped around the cowboy's heart like barbed wire, and the 200 warriors who had placed their faith, unasked, upon his shoulders, who saw in him a bridge that could carry them away from the blood promised by their rivals, though he could not fathom why fate had chosen him for such a role. He raked his hands through his hair, muttering curses at the unfairness of it, at the cruel joke of being asked to stand between peoples when he had already failed to keep safe the one woman he had loved, when his own land withered beneath his hands like it sought to remind him he was no steward worth trusting. And he wondered what would happen if he simply closed his doors and let the storm roll past. Would they all vanish back into the night, the warriors fading like a mirage, the settlers returning to their suspicions, leaving him to his solitude and the slow rot of his ranch? But even as the thought passed, his stomach twisted, because he knew it would not be so, that to walk away was to abandon the boy, whose hand had clutched his in terror, whose whisper had carried across the fire like a prayer. And to abandon him was something the cowboy could not stomach, not after already losing too much to the pitiless hand of fate. Yet still the fear gnawed at him. If he chose to stand with the warriors, would the settlers drive him out, burn his barn, spit his name like poison? If he chose to stand aside, would the boy's eyes ever forgive him? Or would those 200 men ride to their deaths believing him a coward who had taken their gifts and given nothing in return? He stopped pacing, leaning hard against the stall door, his breath ragged, sweat slicking his palms though the air was cool, and in the restless shadows he saw the truth he did not want to face. There was no path free of blood, no choice that would not brand him with consequence, only the question of which weight he could bear without breaking, the condemnation of his own people, or the betrayal of those who had looked at him with hope he did not deserve. And as he closed his eyes, the child's soft breathing filling the silence, he knew that dawn would come whether he chose or not, and when it did, the land itself might judge him harsher than either side. The first light of dawn spilled across the prairie in pale streaks of gold, igniting the mist that clung to the grass like smoke from unseen fires, and as the barn doors creaked open beneath his hand, the cowboy felt that light fall upon him as though the very heavens sought to drag his choice into the open. Outside, the 200 warriors were already mounted, their painted faces turned east to the rising sun, the breath of their horses steaming in the chill, their silence deeper than any war cry could have been. And when their eyes shifted to him in unison, it was as though the weight of an entire world settled on his shoulders, a world balanced on the knife edge of his decision. Behind him, the child stirred, rubbing sleep from his eyes, clutching the carved token that had been pressed into his hand the night before. And the cowboy knew that to retreat now, to step back into the barn and shut himself away, would not only betray the boy but also sever the fragile thread of hope spun around the firelight, a thread that might yet weave two peoples into something more than enemies. Still, his heart thundered with dread, for he knew that by stepping forward, by placing himself as the bridge, he risked not only his life but his place among his own kind, who would brand him traitor for siding with those they called savage, who would burn his ranch to cinders if they discovered where his loyalties leaned. He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused, hands that had failed to keep fever from stealing his wife, that had failed to coax life from barren fields, and he thought of the nights he had paced this barn cursing his weakness, and yet here those same hands were called to a greater work, not of crops or graves but of peace, fragile as glass and perilous as loaded steel. He took one step forward, the sound of his boot in the dirt cracking the silence like a gunshot, and every mounted figure straightened, waiting, their patience that of men who knew destiny was not always shouted but chosen in silence. He felt the boy's small hand slip into his, anchoring him to the moment, and with that touch the fear eased enough for him to raise his head, to meet the eyes of the elder whose nod had set this path in motion, and in that gaze he found no demand, no command, only expectation. This was not about power, not about conquest, but about trust freely given, trust that could not be returned to the earth once planted. His chest tightened, breath-catching, but he forced the words out, his voice low yet carrying into the morning air, telling them with all the steadiness he could muster that he would walk this road, that he would stand between fire and blood as best a man could, though he knew the weight of it might crush him. And when the last word left his lips, the warriors did not cheer, did not break their solemnity with sound, but their stillness shifted, as if the very earth beneath their horses had taken a breath, as if a storm had been held at bay by a single choice, and the elder lifted his hand, palm to the sun, in a gesture that sealed what had been spoken. The cowboy's heart remained heavy with dread, but beneath it flickered a stubborn flame. Fragile peace was no guarantee of survival, but it was hope, and as he stepped fully into the dawn with the boy at his side, he knew he had chosen to carry it, no matter the cost.